Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another VES-Artex Academy webinar. Today, we're going to be speaking with Katelyn Mills, who is from the University of British Columbia's Animal Welfare Program. Today, she's talking about the challenges and opportunities for human resource management on dairy farms. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that we'll be answering questions towards the end of the session. You can ask your questions through either the chat feature or the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll also have a short poll at the end, and we will answer any questions that we can. If we don't answer them, we'll get back to you personally after the event. So thank you very much, Katelyn. The floor is yours.
Get all the slides ready here. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me today. As was mentioned, my name is Katelyn Mills, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Animal Welfare Program at the University of British Columbia. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the work that I did for my PhD, specifically focusing on some of the challenges, but I would argue some of the opportunities for human resource management on dairy farms. So for today's presentation, I really want to focus on two main parts. And the first is kind of what we know so far from the literature in terms of human resource management practices. And then the second, how do we develop standard operating procedures that can work for your farm? And this is based on a study that we did with farmers in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. And so I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, I can convince at least some of you that we can use SOPs to be really effective and to help with employee accountability. So human resource management, when I was working with farmers and veterinarians to understand different animal care decisions as part of my PhD research, one thing that kept coming up time and time again was this idea that farmers' jobs have changed over the years. So as farms are increasing in size, you're having to bring on so many more employees than maybe you only had family employees before. There's all this paperwork that comes along with all these different programs that are now requirements for the industry. And farmers kept asking, well, how do we do this? How do we write these SOPs? How do we train our employees? And that got me thinking a little bit about what had been currently done in the literature to answer some of those questions. And so I really wanted to do a review of that to see what we could learn from the existing literature. And so this review that I focused on 5 main areas. The first is professional accreditation programs. So that's things like ProAction and other industry programs. The different extension or education opportunities that are out there and what's most effective and maybe what isn't. The role of advisors, specifically looking at the role of veterinarians, but also us as researchers, how we're involved or could be involved in this process, and other advisors like nutritionists and other farmers as well. Employee training, I know that's a big one for a lot of people. How do we train employees and retain employees so that we have good quality labor? And then finally, standard operating procedures. So how do we use these for many practices on the farm, but also specifically what we're interested in is animal care practices, and how can we use this to kind of decrease that variation on farm and hopefully be more than just a requirement of ProAction. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes going through each of these sections and talking about kind of what are some of the key findings we have from this available literature, and then talk about how this can be applied in the context of the Canadian dairy farm. So professional accreditation systems. Around the world, we're seeing more and more of these programs pop up from the consumer assurance perspective. That's a big driver of this. So the ProAction initiative is a perfect example of that. But we're also seeing other animal welfare programs, other organic standards, so many different programs that are out there. And each of those have their own set of paperwork, their own specific requirements of what kind of that benchmark is that we're wanting to hit. But this is good because from what we know about these programs in other industries is that they build public trust, they promote professional responsibility, and they are a way to provide this assurance that you are getting a quality product. So this is really important in the dairy industry because we know that the public is super concerned about animal welfare issues, and that's growing more and more all the time. And so this step of including all these programs like ProAction is a way to professionalize your industry and offer that public trust that is so important for future success of the industry. But there's so many different programs out there, and sometimes that can cause some confusion. For the consumer, that's confusion kind of at the store when they go and they see all these products and they all have a different little logo on it that's talking about a different program. But also for you as farmers, because like I mentioned, they all have different sets of paperwork. They all have different benchmarks that you're looking for. But some things we know that make these different programs effective. So there's some work in the US that looks at, they compared a bunch of these different programs. And what they found was that these accreditation programs can pick out the farms that need a little bit of extra help. So they're able to pick out the farms that aren't quite meeting these benchmarks, no matter what the program is. And so that's a good sign, right? It means that they're picking up the things that we want them to pick up on. We also know that they're most effective if they're led by producers. If they're created by farmers and developed by farmers and used by farmers, they're going to be more effective because you're going to have that buy-in. But it's also been shown that these audits, the audits that are necessary in order to keep these programs running, need to be done by a credible source. Because if someone comes onto your farm and they are auditing your animals or your barns, and you don't feel like they have the expertise to be doing that, you're probably not going to trust them, and you're probably not going to trust in the program either. So the next section that we looked at was this idea of extension or education opportunities. And I wanted to start off to give a little bit of a distinction between the US and the Canadian model. And so when I'm talking about extension, in the US, these are based at the universities. So the land-grant universities, they have offices where all these extension opportunities are offered through. Whereas in Canada, this model has typically been tied to the government, and then with government cutbacks, those extension offices were slowly cut back over time. And so we're seeing more privatized models of extension. So when I'm talking about privatized models, that would be wonderful webinar series like this one, but also education seminars, maybe through your veterinary clinic, or some work through universities, but it isn't a core tenet of those universities. But what can we learn about what actually makes these different programs effective? The first is that discussion groups have been shown to be a really effective way of working through problems on your farm. So if you get a group of farmers together, they're able to talk through the problem, they're able to work through issues that they're having with other farmers who have gone through maybe similar things. And from the literature, we can see that if the topic is somatic cell count, these discussion groups have been shown to decrease somatic cell count over time on individual farms by working through problems. They've been shown to increase farm efficiency. They've been shown to increase farmers' confidence in running their business. And so just being able to talk out your problems with those that will understand is really helpful. Now, most of the stuff we've seen on this so far has been kind of at the industry level. So you have lots of farmers from different farms coming together. But this also could be really helpful at the farm level. Getting together, having a discussion group or a farm meeting with people on the farm to maybe work through problems that you're having that could be solved with a little bit of open communication. This part, and probably this whole section, is not going to be super surprising, but other sources of information that people have found to be really helpful. So things like magazines like Horde's Dairyman or Progressive Dairy, podcasts. Progressive Dairy has a pretty good podcast that they put out. And so things like that, where you can pick which source of information is going to be helpful for you when you're looking for specific education opportunities. And interestingly, and I'm curious about this one, because before what we've seen is that online resources have not been found to be very useful in different contexts. I'm really curious if this is going to change in the post-COVID-19 world, because I don't know about you guys, but I have become very proficient in Zoom over the last year. And so I wonder if we're going to see a shift in where people are accessing that information as well. But if I want to give just one take-home message from this section, I think it really would be find the method that works best for you, find the source that works best for you. I know I love listening to a podcast if I'm taking the dog for a walk or driving to work. So just find the thing that will allow you to fit this into your everyday life. The role of advisors is a very big, complicated topic that a lot of researchers have been working on for years. When I'm talking about advisors, that's veterinarians, other farmers, nutritionists. Where do we as researchers fit into this whole system? But since our lab works on animal welfare issues, one really interesting thing that's come out from the literature is that animal welfare issues or conversations around animal welfare topics are most accepted if they come from someone that is viewed by the farmer as a trusted advisor. And it kind of makes sense, right? Some of these conversations are uncomfortable, and so you're going to be more open to listening to someone that you view as a trusted advisor. And it's probably no surprise to anyone that's listening that in the dairy industry, veterinarians are really viewed as that trusted advisor to dairy farmers. They're on farm regularly, you're working through problems together, and so you really do build up that relationship. Even to the point where farmers want veterinarians to point out things that they've become barn blind to. And so barn blind is when you're doing the same thing every day, you're walking the barn, things that might fade into the background and you aren't able to pick up as easily as someone who comes in with a fresh set of eyes that maybe is able to pick out things that you might not have noticed. But like some of the other topics that we've talked about so far, it's not all sunshine and roses. There are some issues when it comes to how farmers and their advisors work together. So for example, there is some evidence that advisors make assumptions about farmers' goals without actually discussing it with them. So that can cause some miscommunication or maybe frustration between the farmer and their advisor. And also there's some evidence that advisors don't always work well together. So say you have one advisor and they're offering you one bit of advice and someone else is saying something else, and they're not really agreeing, but also don't want to sit down and have a conversation together. So in both of these cases, again, we can come back to this idea of discussion groups and sitting down and having a farm meeting, because that can kind of alleviate some of that tension that you might be feeling if there's people that maybe don't want to have a direct conversation. So employees, I know this is a big topic, and after working with quite a few farmers during my PhD, finding engaged and reliable employees is a challenge. And you see this with kind of an increase in going towards foreign temporary workers or temporary foreign workers, or because just the local employees aren't there. And this is not unique to Canada. We're seeing this in regions in other countries as well. The US has been struggling with this for a while. But let's say, and this might be a jump, but let's say you do have those employees. Let's say you have those reliable employees. You're really happy with how things are going, but now you have to train them. And most common strategies on dairy farms is kind of shadowing employees, right? So you have the new employee, they come and they work with you or maybe another existing employee to teach them how to do things. But there are some shortfalls to this approach. I know if I'm if I'm explaining something to someone, but it's a task that I complete a couple times a day, every day for years, I might skip over a bunch of steps that are really important, but I don't think to explain them because, well, that's just what you do. But that's how things get missed. And perhaps that's when you see employees that you feel aren't completing the task exactly how you want them to do it. And so what can we learn from the literature? Well, we must be able to clearly communicate our farm goals and tasks. And it's not only important that the employee knows how they're supposed to do something, but also the why of a task. Why do you want me to do it this way? Why is it important to you? And this is where written materials can be really helpful because then you can make sure that all that material is in a document and it's not being lost along the way. But on that point of written materials, these things need to be simple, right? They need to be simple and accessible because you're going to have people of all different levels of education. You're going to have perhaps language barriers on the farm. And so making sure that what you have to train your employees is going to be understood by all of the different employees that are on the farm. And then finally, another thing that we see in different articles about what's the best way to present this material, it really depends on your individual farm, but some things that have been shown to be helpful, laminated posters that can be hung in the barn, flowcharts, so that if there's decisions that need to be made, the employee is able to work through that flowchart and make that decision. Videos can be really helpful. These are great training tools so that you can show the videos to the new employees before they get on the farm, and then they're able to better integrate into the training once they get there. Or educational seminars. So maybe you have your veterinarian come in and chat with you guys about a problem that you're having or something that you'd like to train your employees on. So for this next section, standard operating procedures or SOPs. So what we can see from other contexts, so outside of the dairy industry, is that SOPs can decrease variation in how tasks are performed. They can be used as training tools. So again, getting back to this idea of employee training. And we know that SOPs are required on farms in Canada for the ProAction program, but also for other programs as well. But what we don't see in the literature is anything about how SOPs are being used, or if they're being used, and how they're actually being developed on these farms. Who's involved in that development? Where is this advice coming from when you're putting these SOPs together? And so those were some of the questions that myself and Katie Korleski, who is a colleague of mine and pictured here on the screen, we had all these questions about, well, how are they actually working on dairy farms? How are SOPs actually working? And so we wanted to put together a study to try to understand that a bit better, and during the study to be able to help farmers put together an SOP that they could actually use on their farm. So for our study, we focused on colostrum management and newborn calf care. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that we know it's a requirement of ProAction, so we know that you all have to have them, but also from an animal welfare perspective, colostrum management is super important. We know that getting that good quality colostrum in those calves quickly is going to set them up for success down the road. And so for those two reasons, that's why we decided to focus on this SOP. So what did we actually do? We met with farmers over 3 meetings, and this was usually between a 3 and 6 month period back in 2018. And so at first we just met with the farmers, got to know them a little bit, collected some information, and took a photo of their current SOP. At the end of that meeting, we then asked farmers, okay, well, we're going to develop this new SOP. Who would you like to have at the table? Who do you want there when we're doing that? And so they could invite their veterinarian, their nutritionist, the employees, or maybe they just wanted to do it themselves. So they had the option of who to invite. And then we sat down and we put together this SOP. Katie and I brought lots of different templates for people to look at, see what worked best for their farm. And yeah, we put that together. And then at the very end of that meeting, we asked that the farmers use it. And then we would follow up in 3 months to see what worked, if they were having any struggles with the new SOP or anything that they changed. And so at the end of all that, we had so many documents, we had so many SOPs, we had so many interview transcripts and focus groups and all of this data. And Katie and I went through and we analyzed all of it, and there were a bunch of themes that kind of came out. And some of those results I'd like to present to you now. And the first big one that I find really interesting was this almost debate in these meetings of what is the purpose of an SOP? Why do we actually need to have these? And so one of the things that people kept coming back to was this need to ensure industry-wide standards are met. So we have the National Farm Animal Care Council has their code of practice, which is then put into the ProAction program. We want to make sure that those industry standards are met. Again, coming back to this idea of consumer trust and professionalization really of the dairy industry. But for individuals, we also want to make sure that it's a safeguard in case something happens. So if you aren't able to work, if you aren't able to, say we're talking milking SOPs, if you aren't able to milk your cows or your employees aren't able to milk your cows, who's going to do it? And are they going to be able to step in? Is there maybe strange things that happen on your farm? So even if someone else is a dairy farmer, they might not know how you do things. So it really is a safeguard in case something happens, that the procedures are still able to be done. And then finally, one thing that came up quite a bit was this idea that, well, it's just a requirement of ProAction and I have to have it, but that's it. And I'm hoping that if people resonate with that reason, that I'm able to convince you otherwise in this last half of the talk, because I think we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of people that had SOPs that they had them, and that's wonderful, but they were in a binder, in a filing cabinet, in the office, and came out maybe once a year for the audit. But hopefully we're able to make them a little more effective for everyday use on the farm. So another theme that kept coming out was this idea of, okay, well, who is the SOP actually for? And I think this quote from a farmer actually sums it up pretty nicely, which is that it totally depends who your audience is. Is it the farmer or the farm manager who is ultimately responsible for the care? Is it the individual who in the moment may or may not be there? Each individual is so different in how they learn and what they follow. And I totally agree with this farmer. It depends who your audience is. But I think that's your job, or your farm's job, is to understand, okay, well, here are my employees, here are the people that are on my farm. I want to make sure that this SOP works for everyone. How do I write it so that it does? And so I think it is an important conversation of understanding who your audience is, but that is going to change from farm to farm. And then another, kind of tying back to this purpose of the SOP, but why is an SOP important? And I really like this quote that I'm going to present from a veterinarian who I think sums it up really nicely. They say, because if employees understand that it matters to you and it's important, the colostrum management gets done, and it gets done well. It gives people the reason why it's important, because a lot of people don't necessarily see that. They see it as one extra step. And so again, getting back to, it's not enough to teach people how to do things, but you really have to give them the why it's important. So when it came to actually sitting down and developing these new SOPs, everyone had an SOP when we started. So everyone had something that was existing, but most of the SOPs either came from a veterinary clinic, maybe the clinic had put together something for the farm, or it was more of the ProAction template that ProAction had sent out when the animal care modules were rolling out. And this is great, right? It fulfills all the requirements of ProAction. It lists all the important information when it comes to colostrum management and calf feeding. But one thing that we kept noticing when we would actually walk through what farmers were doing was that what was written in the SOP and what was actually done day to day were often quite different. And we wanted farmers to actually create some SOPs that accurately reflected what was happening on their farm. So that could mean that it is still text-based. That could mean that it's a list of steps, step one, all the way through to the end. And that's great, but really just making sure that it includes the specifics of what you're doing on your farm. And this means that SOPs need to be updated because practices change over time. Maybe you are now feeding calves more, or you're feeding more times a day, or you're now using powdered colostrum as opposed to fresh colostrum, or whatever the case is. Things are going to change over time. And the goal is to make sure that the SOP reflects current practice. So putting a version number or a date that the SOP was revised so that you can make sure you're checking in and revising those at regular intervals. But also, maybe you want to get a little creative with your SOPs. This is an example of an SOP from a farmer who put together a flowchart for their colostrum management. So it could be something that shows, okay, here are all the decisions that need to be made. These can be really helpful for employees because it gives them kind of a roadmap of how you make the decisions. But also there could be videos. We had one farm that we walked around and filmed videos of everything that happened as part of the colostrum management process. And then those can be used as training tools for new employees that start. Pictures are also another great one. If you have employees where, again, language might be a bit of a barrier, or reading comprehension might be a bit of a barrier, then having pictures of what needs to be done. So if it's for putting the ear tag on calves, having a picture of exactly where you want that ear tag to make sure that they're not falling out, things like that to help to incorporate pictures into these SOPs as well. So when it came to these discussions, we didn't actually have any farms that invited employees to take part in this practice. We had a couple herd managers that were part of the discussions, lots of veterinarians that were there, but unfortunately we didn't have employees that were part of this SOP development. And I think what we see from other industries is that having employees part of these discussions can actually be really beneficial because it helps to create that employee buy-in. The employees feel like they have a voice in how things are done on the farm. And also farmers were still talking about some challenges that they were having with employees as part of this conversation. So by having the employees there, we might've been able to work through some of those problems as well. But a couple specific things, I've mentioned this a few times already, but this issue of language and how that can potentially be a barrier. But we see this, there's a lot of research on this in the US because they have a large Hispanic population that are part of the dairy industry. And language doesn't actually have to be a barrier there. There are really creative ways you can go about helping with that problem. One of them is creating little pocket dictionaries so that the employees have something on hand that they're able to work through. But this doesn't have to be an impossible barrier to overcome. Another thing that came up was this idea of employee experience. So on the one hand, we had, if there was really new employees, that was sometimes a challenge because maybe they'd never worked on a dairy farm before or didn't have any practical experience in ag in general. But one thing that I found really interesting was that the opposite problem was also true. So you might have an employee that has lots of experience and has been there for years, but this could almost be more of a problem because they might be very set in their ways. And it might be more difficult to convince them to change how they've been doing things for many years. So this is where training is important, but also retraining. So revisiting maybe every time you update those SOPs, everyone gets retrained on them, no matter how long you've been on the farm, but really making sure that experience is not a barrier there, either too little or too much. All right. When we're talking about, again, coming back to this employee challenge, some people felt like they wanted a way to track whether people were actually completing the procedures that they wanted them to complete. So tracking of procedures was a big thing, but how do we actually go about doing that? And so calf cards is one example. This is a template that we helped create for a farmer. These can be cut out and placed on individual calf pens or hutches, and you can have all that information so you know, okay, you know when she's been fed, you know what time she was born, you know what the colostrum quality reading was on the colostrum she received, or any other things. These are totally customizable. And there's the nice thing about these is that you can track back. So you can keep these either in a binder or you can laminate them if you want and reuse them. But you have that information that can then be, you can look back over time and see, okay, this calf or this heifer now is sick, and I want to go back and see, well, how did she do early in life? So just that tracking and that importance of data as well. But maybe you like more of a kind of a checklist style. So we had several of these as well. I really like this example because clearly this checklist has been used. It was hanging up in the barn. And what they're tracking here is colostrum quality, how soon after birth the calf was fed, whether she got fresh or powdered colostrum, and even whether she was born on the pack or in the pen. And this is because they were seeing some trends there and they wanted to try and tease that out a bit and figure out what was going on. And so all of this is just another way of keeping track of what's going on for each individual calf. So every row is an individual calf in this case. We also had some farmers that included a column that you could put the employee's initials. So if you really wanted to see, okay, who's doing what, you can have every time employee X feeds a calf, they initial it with, so that you're able to go back and check if something happens. You want to check in with them. Well, how was she looking when you saw her? All that kind of thing just increases that employee accountability as well. And so here is just another example of a checklist from a farmer. In this case, this is the cow they were tracking. So they had what lactation she was, how much she milked out at first milking, and then what the colostrum quality was with the Brix meter. Now, sometimes farmers really liked the advice that either their vet or myself and Katie or that they heard from other farmers when it came to changing their SOPs. But sometimes it just really didn't work for their specific management. And this is perhaps my favorite example of that, because one farmer said, well, we had little calf cards and that was working good. We could laminate them and stuff, but the calves eat them. So we had to stop using them because the cards are bigger than the stand. They had little stands beside their calf pens. And so the babies, they see them and they lick them, and we've lost a bunch. And so sometimes, even though everyone had the best of intentions, those crafty little calves outsmarted us on that one. But it's really just finding something that's going to work for your individual farm management and trial and error as well. All right, and the last result I want to share with you here is, I think, a really important thing that came out, and again, probably not surprising to a lot of people here, but really just the importance of data when we're making animal care decisions. This one example that I'm going to present, they were collecting all kinds of info on their calves, but they were also taking assessing passive transfer success. So they were drawing blood to do that with their vet. And they found that from 1 month to the next, there was a huge jump. So I think it was August to September, and there was a huge jump. They went from failing, most of their calves failing, to almost perfect success rate. And they thought about that for a long time. So we thought about that for a long time because that's significant. We think it's because we had no hired help. Our last guy finished and we had no hired help after the end of August. So they had their protocol in place and they assumed it was happening, but we think it probably wasn't. So again, getting back to this idea that by collecting all this data, by having all this information on their calves, they were able to pick out a really big area in terms of employee problems. So they had an employee that was supposed to be feeding the calves. And then when this employee left, the family took over again and suddenly everything was going perfectly. So this really, again, this issue of how do we make sure that employees are doing things exactly as we want them to. Okay, so that is it for the results that I have there, but I just want to come back to a few kind of bullet points of how do we tailor SOPs to your farm? Because I think that ultimately is the message that I hope that we leave this conversation with. And the first is that templates are great. I am not here to knock templates. I know that creating SOPs is a challenge. It's a lot of work, and I get that. But just keeping in mind that they can't be followed by employees if they aren't specific to your farm. So really making sure that you are making these as farm specific SOPs. And even if you do have a template, adjusting it and adapting it so that everything is accurate for you. One thing we found when we were putting together these SOPs with the farmers is we sat down and we said, okay, walk us through the whole procedure, starting from what you do at the very start before you get the colostrum from the cow or before you prepare the colostrum for the calf. And we walked through each of those steps and we took notes throughout the whole thing. And then we were able to look back and farmers were like, oh, I missed a step. And so then we go back and we add the step in. And so really just going through that whole process of making sure that all of those steps are included in your SOP. Also just sitting down with your farm staff, so employees and advisors, to really help develop them together. This, again, in other industries has been shown to be best practice for creating SOPs. Having multiple voices in the room, or even having people that can edit them. And I think that's my next point. Having someone else to look over them or read through them once you feel like you have a pretty good draft of an SOP. We had some farms that they had their draft and then they gave it to an employee or a family member and they said, okay, go do this task now and tell me what I missed, as a way to have someone else check up and see if there's anything missing. And then again, this idea of accountability. So how do we actually make sure that these SOPs are followed? Having employees' initial checklist is a great way to do that. Then they have to put their name beside it and you're able to check in with them if something happens. And create employee buy-in by including them in this whole process. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about having everyone at the table and included in that discussion, because that can make employees feel like they're part of the team. And that's really important when we're talking about employee management. And I actually just want to point out as well, when I'm talking about employees, I don't just mean external employees outside of the farm family. I think it's really important that we're also having these conversations with family members, because sometimes that's even harder to do. And so including family members in that discussion as well. And then finally, checking in with employees regularly. So that could mean farm meetings. Maybe you have a once a month meeting where everyone sits down, you order a pizza, and you talk through any problems that are happening. But also these could be training sessions. So maybe when you update those SOPs every year, you hand them out to everyone and you see if you can get some feedback on these SOPs, if you can use them to train new and existing employees, or even invite your veterinarian or ask your veterinarian to come over and give some kind of training session as well. All right, so some take-home messages from all of that we've talked about so far. Your jobs have changed, and a human resource manager is a whole position on its own in other industries, and now you all are expected to be human resource managers, which is a huge undertaking. And so I hope that discussions like this, or actually that Progressive Dairy podcast that I mentioned has an awesome episode about human resource management. Just finding sources of information that can help you do that is going to be super important moving forward. And I strongly believe that SOPs do not just need to be paperwork for assurance programs. By creating something that's going to work for your individual farm and help you train your employees and decrease that variation that's happening across staff, it can really help you manage your farm. And from an animal welfare perspective, we know cows love routine. They like things to be kept the same. They like the same thing every day. And so by incorporating SOPs in that, we can help decrease that variation for the cows as well. And then including other people in that SOP development, like we already talked about, and creating those farm-specific documents can help make them more effective. And finally, just turning that SOP into a living document with checklists or CAF cards or other ways to help with not only your own accountability, but accountability for employees as well. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you all so much. I'm really happy that I was asked to come and give this presentation today. I'd specifically like to mention my co-authors on all of this work. So Nina von Kaiserlink and Dan Weary, two faculty members in the Animal Welfare Program at the University of British Columbia, as well as Katie Korleski, my SOP partner in crime for conducting the SOP study with me as well. And then to all of our funding sources who without this research would not have been possible. So to DIREC and the Investment Agriculture Foundation, as well as the Canadian Dairy Commission and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And that's all I have. Thank you all so much for listening. I think we're gonna have some time for a question period, but also if you have any questions at all, I've put my contact information at the bottom of the screen there, and I'm always happy to answer questions or chat about all things SOP.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. We do have a couple of questions for you, but before we get to that, Walter from Germany was saying that without coronavirus, he wouldn't be listening to all of these webinars. So we really appreciate that you have joined us for these. And yes, COVID has changed the way that we communicate with each other. So this is really exciting. The first question that we have is, what about SOPs for small farms with only family employees?
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot. I think that SOPs are just as valuable for small farms as well. Unless you are a one-person operation, which I have not encountered yet. There's likely going to be more than one person working on a farm. And so even just having these conversations and sitting down and going through that SOP, I don't think we take enough time to reflect on kind of everyday practices. And so by setting time aside to work on these SOPs, you are kind of reflecting on how you do things and working through problems that maybe you just haven't had a discussion, but someone else feels there's a problem there. So everyone sitting down together, even if it's just family, I think is super important.
The next question is, do you think that automation in the dairy business can help better educate the young people who are interested into getting farm jobs?
Wow, that's a great question. Automation is a huge conversation. I've done a bunch of interviews with farmers about automation and how we can use this moving forward. In terms of getting young people involved, Yeah, I think that could be a part of it. I don't know if it's necessarily generational, because I know a lot of young people that also aren't very good with technology. So I'm not sure if the generational thing, but I think technology is a big one moving forward. And I don't know if I'm not sure if we have enough information now on how that's all going to go, but it's definitely an exciting area.